So I'm Louise Purbrick and I'm based at the University of Brighton. And the work that I'm going to present today probably addresses most closely concepts of possession. And what I hope to do is rethink some of that in the paper and in my work. But I also want to explain that other research that I have been doing over the last several years kind of intersects with some of the other themes as well. So I work on sites of exploitation and imprisonment. Usually I work with archaeologists or photographers. I am a writer, but I'm always usually engaging with different kinds of ways of interpreting. So those sites have included sites of disused mines in the Atacama Desert in Chile that were then used as Pinochet's jails, and also an empty and now demolished jail in Northern Ireland called Longkesh Maze, which was probably better known as the H blocks. And some of that work I've used to rethink work that I did, which was based using an archive here at the University of Sussex that's now at the Keep, the Mass Observation Archive, which was about the relationship between people and things. So although it seems very disparate, I've begun to think, always rethinking your work, always reflecting and rethinking on your work, that there may be other ways of thinking about material possessions, necessarily than good or bad, but ways of thinking about them as parts of the way in which we shape our world. So most of my work always concerns the relationship between people and things, but also the way in which human culture is embedded in a material culture, which I'll kind of get there in the end, really, when I talk about that. But also one of the issues for me, really, especially looking at the current work in terms of the exploitation of land and labour, is that all of our material possessions could be seen as possibilities, full of hope and dreams, but also as problems. And in this paper, I try and deal with that veer between the hope and the possibility of our material culture, but also material culture as a problem. So the paper will have two sort of theoretical journeys. Hope that's okay with you. I will try and speak slowly through those sections. And those sections are written, so I'll read those, and some of the paper will be spoken. So I'm an academic primarily and a writer, but I've also worked with Maud at the back, Maud Casey, and I would say I am an activist. I often describe myself as an academic and an activist. And some of the work that Maud and I have done over the last few years connect very explicitly with the political context that Liz outlined at the beginning. So there are works where art is used as a sometimes quite confrontational political process, one where we've been used to reimagine works of art, to think about places without borders entirely, revisit concepts of internationality at a time when those are most under threat. So maybe in the breaks we could talk about that. So nice to see you, Maud. Okay, right. I'm just going to begin by reading a few quotes that concern people's objects, and then I'll talk more. So a few bits of writing from real sources housed in Mass Observation Archive. They're rather like poetry, so I'm just going to enjoy reading them. I hope you like to listen. Okay. I still have my mother's teapot intact. I cannot accurately describe it. I'm told that it's black basalt. It has a design of pink, white and blue flowers in relief, interspersed with gold design of leaves, etc. It is valuable to me because Mother valued it. It was only used on high days and holidays. The rest of the time, it reposed on the mantelpiece as a receptacle for savings. One of Mother's brothers gave it to her as a wedding present. Another piece of evidence, if you like, or poetry. I have the hand-painted tea service which my aunt, my mother's eldest sister, gave her as a wedding present. It is a wild rose spray on mint and china with a gold border. It is lovely, and Mother treasured it. It is kept in the old mahogany display cabinet Mother had, and I've only used it once. The same aunt painted a tea set for my wedding present, but I lost 5 cups in an accident. And I'll just move on a little bit. My mum, says another mass observer or another writer, my mum had my grandmother's wedding china. Her china was in use on special occasions. She didn't tell us it was her wedding china until my brother broke some. And another account from mass observation, I knew they had a tiny coffee service because it is kept in our china cabinet and never used. They said they'd used it on their silver wedding anniversary, but my father died when they had been married only 16 years. And another writer, mass observation writer, says, I would not part with the bone china tea set, as it hold quite dear memories of the old couple who are now dead. It's interesting that I'm talking about China, and in fact that's where Mary ended up. And I could make this case, the case I'm going to make around textile objects as well, and that's, but I just thought I'd show and talk through China as a material form. So these texts, which I read first in 1998 and been reading over and over since, have encouraged me to think that objects bind us together, that they hold together a web of relationships. In particular, you could see that China holds together a relationship between a mother and a daughter. And China, particularly bone china, is particularly thin and it's delicate, and it was a popular substitute for porcelain, I'm sure across Europe, but certainly from the interwar period until the immediate post-war period. And bone china is a quite compelling combination of durability and fragility. It does not deteriorate. In fact, ceramics are one of the oldest man-made, human-made substances that we have. It does not deteriorate, but it is easily broken. So it's a remarkably stable substance, but it's also inflexible and therefore brittle. So china will last for many, many years, belong the life of an individual family generation, if it's treated carefully, never used or put under glass. So the power of the object seems to lie both in its coherence, staying together, cups not being broken, and its longevity. And therefore it can appear, china can appear both a metaphor and a metonym for the family. So it establishes family lines. China, therefore, and you can make the case with other objects, connects the living and the dead. So objects that become exchanged between family members and kept in one of those homes can establish continuities between presence and absence, between generations, and across what's often considered this kind of separating barrier between life and death. So since objects usually pass from older and younger generations, so therefore they establish continuities between past and present. And if they are carefully preserved, they last beyond the life of the giver. So they create continuities that allow them to become sacred, if we like. People don't often use that term in our very rational culture, sacred, or even magical. So some of these things I began to think, because of the writings held in the Mass Observation Archive, everyday writings. So sometimes these thoughts have been shaped because of academic study, and sometimes because of just listening to the stories that people have written. Now, I'm not particularly interested in wedding presents, so I wrote a book about wedding presents, but the reason that I wrote about that was because I was interested in how people shape material worlds beyond the market. And so looking at wedding presents was a way of looking at the possession of objects, which was not fashionable, so not dictated by market trends, so a way of cutting through that or under that or beyond that to think about how people relate to their things. So my work I'm not particularly interested at all, actually, in married households compared to any other kinds of households, but it was a way in of thinking about that. And what that raises is the concept, really, of the gift and notions of the gift, which is a very important anthropological term, as I'm sure many of you know. So these objects, china and wedding presents, have allowed me to think about the relationships between people and things, between human cultures and material cultures, or even, if you wanted, between life and the way life is embedded in materiality. So, for example, I've got china objects, but for example, when I was writing this paper, and many of the writings I undertake, I sit at a table upon which various members of my family have eaten their breakfast, and they come and they go with bowls and spoons, and they forget to clear away cereal packets or bottles of milk as they make preparations for the outside world, and as they make preparations to cross thresholds between public and private, domestic and urban, between domestic spaces and the outside world. And they, as everybody has done this morning, actually, because we've all arrived here clothed and with things, but as they gather up goods, they do it in the manner of assembling armour, so tools for work and books and pens for college and school and work, layers of clothing always appropriately adapted. And a huge amount of time is dedicated to making very slight modifications to our dress or the objects that we carry that are probably, completely unrecognisable except to the wearer. So then if you're an academic or a writer or a thinker or an activist, you do so completely surrounded by this clutter. So it therefore becomes imperative that we try and understand the world in which we're completely embedded. So that's one of the reasons why I ended up looking at wedding presents is this is a way of undercutting the dominant categories of the marketplace, but also because we all live our lives in this world of things. I also inherited my nan's things, so this is my maternal grandmother. Most of the objects I inherited were textiles, so aprons, many of them, but also cutlery, a box of spoons and knives and forks. Now these had, until I inherited them, they had never been used, much like the china in the text that I was reading. And I had imagined that they were wedding presents. I actually had no idea of really knowing. But they had been definitely kept for best or simply kept. So my maternal grandmother, married before the Second World War, ran a very humble and frugal home and practiced a very thrifty and resourceful domestic life, but one where there was a daily balance between use and preservation, between a type of guardianship which took no account of fashion or status. And so I decided to use her things. So this is what people eat their breakfasts with in my house. I used her things as a way of honouring her life or respectively using what you have to hand. And what it seemed to me in my maternal grandmother's practice, but also echoed in the accounts in mass observation, was a form of living with objects which actually wasn't about consumption, which is the tendency we tend to think we consume objects, but actually about preservation. So there's one way of thinking about the ways in which we order our homes, where there is a practice of consumption, clearly. That's what's fueling a global market in part. But also, if you think about how in our own homes that we're forever ordering and keeping and not exchanging and moving into cupboards and deciding what's best and storing and preserving. Quite complicated set of practices, not unlike the keeper of a museum or a kind of form of curatorial practice, if we like. But we don't declare it as that, but it's the way in which we make certain kinds of orders. So we could argue that, in fact, we're involved in preservation of things, of our world, of our things, rather than their consumption. So we could start to begin thinking very differently, if we wanted, about our relationship to the material world. And there was a writer called Annette Viner who writes about textile objects, in fact, not China. And one of the things that she argues is that, in fact, what we try to do is we exchange only in order to keep. So what we do is try and exchange everything else but what's most precious to us, as a practice of living a life of kind of meandering our way through the world. So, my account so far has argued, I would say that these aprons, let's say, that belong to my maternal grandmother and now I have, that they have some kind of special or magical properties beyond the fact that they might stop your jeans getting dirty when you're cooking. So there's a sense in which we could call these magical or spiritual, if we wished, if we wanted to go that far. And that account, and this is the first of my sort of theoretical manoeuvres, that account could seem to pose a significant challenge to one of the dominant ways in which objects are understood within the academy, at least, which is as commodities and understood within a Marxist framework. Now, I actually want to argue that it's not, that there's a rethinking of Marxism that I want to offer, rather than a direct challenge. So I'm just going to take everybody through a Marxist critique of the commodity. I hope you forgive me if you know this already, but I'm just going to wander through it. So this critique, and the Marxist critique of the commodity and its subsequent development into a very comprehensive and convincing analytical assault upon cultures of consumption, rests upon the fact that commodities, so more or less everything, bottles of water and everything, cannot be redeemed from their state of alienation. So commodities are empty of all but market values, exchangeable for anything momentarily equivalent, arbitrary, and also empty of values such as money. So they're alienated, this is if you follow the account correctly, they're alienated from the moment of being made. So past existence in production is expediently forgotten in the act of exchange, and if remembered, there is no redemption in production. So it's the kind of account you would find in No Logo, in no Naomi Klein's work. So commodities are formed through the calculated productive capacities of a labour force. the labour the labour of those who comprise that force is measured just to become exchangeable. So we sell ourselves for money. That money then goes into buying the necessities of life. So there's a kind of constant state of alienation from materiality if we kind of follow the argument through. So the commodity is disembodied, quite literally in the sense it has no body, it's disembodied, and it's the repeated exchange reproduces a pervasive culture of acquisition and then loss. So commodity exchanges determine all other forms of exchange, including those between people and their place of production. So relationships themselves become commodified. The human condition standardised with only the freedom to choose only what is the same, which is a quote from Theodore Adorno, who is probably the most sort of pessimistic account of commodity culture. However, Theodore Adorno also said, we are forgetting how to give presents. So although this sounds kind of rather negative, it's really interesting because he argues a calculating logic of commodity exchange can be imposed on gift exchanges. So those that do not give or do not give properly become dehumanised as individuals. And he says, in them wither the irreplaceable faculties which cannot flourish in the isolated cell of inwardness, but only live in contact with the warmth of things. So what he argues that if you do not give, what happens is you experience a kind of a death. A chill descends, he says, on all they do and recoils on those from whom it emanates. He who does not give makes himself a thing and freezes. So what's interesting is what he's offering there is the gift, maybe the wedding presents, maybe the wedding china, or maybe my nan's aprons. He's offering the gift as an alternative to the commodity. And that's a thread that runs through quite a series of anthropological and sociological narratives. And it's one way of thinking that within a Marxist critique, of which Adorno is a really extraordinary example and very powerful example, is that there is still somewhere some magic that resides within the object. Because if you can properly give, and he's arguing that that's a possibility, even though we're forgetting, we haven't forgotten, but we're always on the verge of forgetting, then there is still some magic or spirituality or sacredness within the object world. So what I'm interested in then is there are a number of different ways. How am I doing for time? Okay. There are a number of different ways in which we could think about materiality as a direct challenge to some of the systems which Liz talked about in the beginning. So one of them is art. So one of them is art which is beyond and outside exchange relationships. The other one is the gift. So gift, you could say, gifts, aprons, chinas, they continually dissent from commodity culture. And giving is actually an everyday practice. We all have done this. We've all done it this morning and we'll all do it this afternoon. We'll exchange food with each other. We might lend somebody something. I mean, giving is the moral economy of the family. I mean, we're all involved in that form of exchange. But it's one way of thinking about it as a continuous and everyday dissent from commodity culture. So exchange of gifts have this very lasting effect, but they aren't the dominant paradigm of culture. So it exists, but somehow exists bubbling under the surface. The other kind of challenge, which is probably the most significant and the one that we don't talk about as much, is that the everyday understanding of objects as magical, as sacred or spiritual is counter to the dominant ideologies of the rationality of the market, but it persists. So we all believe that we all have, I remember listening to somebody who said we all have special things, so we all have special things. And if we do, then that knowledge of that object or that feeling about that object is something that runs counter to every of the ideologies of the marketplace where we consume and dispose and emerge anew every day as a consumer or a producer. So there's a domain within our everyday life where we have, without naming the name, have a continual practice of dissent and a very everyday practice and continually unnoticed. So we could say that the significance of materiality is counter to dominant ideologies of the market and that it slightly eludes rationality, but almost. So what I'm arguing, I suppose, is that within the dominant order of things, there is our own belief systems that circulate continually and permanently. And in order to think through this, when I started this research, I turned to an anthropologist called Marcel Mauss. So I just want my second theoretical manoeuvre. I'm just going to take you through his work, if that's okay, very quickly. If that's all right? Okay. So, Marcel Mauss, he's a theorist of the gift. And he's often cast by other anthropologists as either too rational or irrational. So, working too much within Western paradigms or too much outside of them, which is kind of interesting. Marcel Mauss wrote a 1925 essay called The Gift. It's quite an interesting way of reimagining Europe. The moment he was writing about it was in between the wars, and he was from a sort of social democratic tradition and trying to imagine social solidarities across differences in that period between the First and the Second World War. So his main argument, which you could argue is both a sort of surrealist or structuralist manoeuvre, he argues that the real meaning of the gift is its opposite, which is something that I've been trying to do, not very successfully, but just sort of trying to do in this paper. So he says the gift appears to be free, but actually it's obligatory. So Mauss has identified obligations to give, receive, and to reciprocate. And he says that we have to do this. He argues then that gifts create a bond that can only be broken by giving another appropriately significant gift in return, and as the gift is relinquished, the bond is rejuvenated. So gifts become pivotal in cycles of exchange, and they enforce solidarities of indebtedness. They therefore sustain friendships, families, communities, and societies. So gifts are social, and they're governed by the rule of reciprocity. The need to reciprocate, to give back, is the imperative to give back something to a person who gave something to you, because what he argues is gifts are never properly separated from those who exchange them. So there's a connection between the giver and the gift is never over when the exchange is concluded. So the connection between the giver and the gift remains a permanent tie that's only broken by giving back a gift, and then you enforce the cycle again. It's not uncommon to say that objects have an aura. It's not uncommon to say they have an aura or a kind of patina, that they bring with them the age or the context. But a Maussian argument is actually that the hand of the giver remains with the gift, so that the object is embodied through its act of exchange. And Mauss, in his 1925 essay, trawled through different kinds of cultures and then produced his theory as a sort of synthesis. All those kinds of cultures were mostly non-European, but what I would argue is when you look closely at giving practices in contemporary European contexts, the fact that they echo or mimic or are the very kinds of forms that Mauss talked about. So he's both rational and irrational. What anthropologists accuse him of being these things. One of them is Annette Weiner, whose work I do really like, has said the model of reciprocity is a market model. So he imposed a market model on his understanding of exchange. But other anthropologists have admired him for accepting that objects carry with them the hand of a person, so that they have a kind of spiritual link to the person who gave them. So he could be both things. He could be working within a European context or working within a non-European context. So, for example, French anthropologist Maurice Godelier, he argues that the cycle of exchanges, which I've described, they repeat as long as the rule of reciprocity is upheld, but that rule of reciprocity is based on the belief that the giver never leaves the gift. And that's simply a belief. That's just that Mauss believed. That's his informants, mostly Maori informants, via the translation of somebody called Eldon Best. He believed that was the case. So Godelier argues he's believing the beliefs of his informants, and therefore he's not a proper anthropologist looking above societies and working out patterns rather than accepting the content. However, more recently, a set of anthropologists called Amira Hanari and Martin Holbrad and Sari Wastel have said that Mauss's contribution was to take seriously the identification of aspects of personhood with the things he collectively identified as gifts. Instead of dismissing ancestral artefacts as objects imbued with the personality of former owners, as evidence of superstition, he embraced these unfamiliar identities, marshalling them into a critique of assumptions that prevailed in his own society. And mostly, I think, probably he did that for the same reasons that when I was looking at texts about wedding presents or thinking about how I have breakfast in my house or what I do with my nan's things, is there's a kind of rhythm or recurrence, I suppose, of his ideas within everyday practice if we could begin to accept that objects are in part human in form. So it's to do with accepting the ways in which materiality is in fact an embodied process. So there's a critique or a sort of academic position which is close to something called mutualism, that accepts that material cultures and human cultures are completely entwined such that they are indistinguishable. So all material cultures have in some sense some forms of animation with them, whatever they are, and that human cultures are always inevitably material. And so there's a not particularly famous writer who I found really useful. He's a very nice person, probably. He writes very nicely, called Paul Graves-Brown. And he argues that we perhaps need to come to terms with the notion of a sense of humanity acting within the world rather than upon it. And that matter, material world, is not something that is ever transcended by cultural practice. So we become ourselves or remember our ancestors through materiality. So in terms of a contribution to the territorialities, it would be the sense of which those territories, both possessions and their borders, are things which are actively under construction, material forms that are also embodied and human, at least in part or in whole. So thank you.